Give me great pleasure to welcome Colin Graham. His talk today is Beyond Silicon Valley, Developing Communities of Innovation. So if we could just get that presentation up. Colin is founder of Causeway Innovation, which is enabling businesses and regions to prosper through innovation. And I think it's really very topical in the context of obviously the conference, and we're really excited to hear what you've got to share with us today. So please put your hands together and welcome Colin. Thank you.
Are you able to move this?
Yeah, sure. Okay. Yep.
I'll just go. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, good. Well, you're going to sort of have to work through one bit of an Irish accent, which I'm still trying to throw off after 15 years in Australia. And it's quite cool, but hopefully after a minute or two you'll tune in and figure out what on earth this guy's saying. Okay. So this morning, what I want to talk about is titles Beyond Silicon Valley and Developing Communities of Innovation. And I really deliberately picked this topic because even as I've seen at this conference a little bit, and you see in the media a little bit as well, there's an awful lot of hype, an awful lot of talk about innovation across Australia and across the world. You know, in this state government's picked it up big time, which is great. Federal government's pushing it. That's all cool. So there's a lot of talk, but I think a lot of that talk, is maybe a little bit misplaced and emphasizes startups and emphasizes startups a lot and almost everything else not at all. And what I'd like to suggest is, yeah, startups are amazingly important, but they're only one part of the picture. And it's a little bit like, in terms of analogy, if you're thinking about sort of business development and people development, it's a little bit like thinking, people development starts and ends at the maternity ward, and that's it. There's no primary school, there's no high school, there's no university, there's no TAFE. It's all about the maternity ward and birthing these new businesses, and our interest should kind of just stop once they're born. And all the evidence, all the experience I have working with businesses across Australia, and all the research heavily points to that's not the fact. A lot of the research points to innovation comes from companies of all sizes. So I'm going to talk about that today. So lots and lots of talk about innovation, and a lot of that talk is about these type of places, if I go back. So it's about predominantly Silicon Valley, which is the area just south of San Francisco and that whole Bay Area. So it's a massive, massive concentration of talent, investment, energy. So it's where people like Facebook and Apple and Uber and so on, that's where all they are based. And it's really a big magnet for talent. So from across the world, lots and lots of people are coming there to tap into that energy, tap into that talent and start a new business. Other places around the world, like London, are coming up big time. I used to work in a place called Old Street in London, and it was a pretty run-down sort of area. I worked there in about 1989-90, and it's a pretty run-down area, and that's almost precisely why it became a startup hub, because it was low rent, it was close to the city, good transport links, but it was sort of cheap and cheerful, and gradually it's grown as a real startup hub for London. New York's big, particularly in things like media, advertising, and even other places you might not have heard of. Tel Aviv is actually consistently one of the top 5, top 10 places in the world in terms of innovation hotspot. So those places are all fantastic, amazing, wonderful, great, and we can learn a lot from them, but I don't think we should try to just exactly mimic them and be exactly the same as them. I think we need to find our own thing and find out for your city, for your region, what can you be great at? What can you sort of sprinkle a bit of innovation on, sprinkle a bit of technology on, and really make that region go much more successful? So it's quite funny. Just preparing for this conference, I just did a quick Google about who's going to be the next Silicon Valley. And if you Google, the news little option and on the search, up came Ukraine. Could Ukraine be the next Silicon Valley? Which maybe do one of your votes for it. Which do you have a vote? Is it going to be Ukraine? Is it going to be Vietnam? The BBC, no less, thinks, could Vietnam be the next Silicon Valley? And Malcolm Turnbull, Western Sydney is going to be the next Silicon Valley. No, we don't seem so sure about that one, right? Or is this black screen going to be the next Silicon Valley? Let me see. Any ideas what they're back on? Just push on. There we go. Thank you. Okay. Press the wrong button, it's the cold. And then, could Cuba, all this new stuff going on in Cuba, could Cuba be the next Silicon Valley? Well, in many ways, I think it's asking all the wrong question. It's just a false premise. I don't think any of these are going to be the next Silicon Valley. One of the reasons for that is that Silicon Valley itself took at least 200 years or so to build. At least 200 years. You can sort of figure out the detailed timeline, but it's about 200 years. So if you want to start, if Cuba wants to be the next Silicon Valley, we'll all go back in 200 years and check it out and say, is it the next Silicon Valley or not? Did we win the vote and where's our prize beer or something? Yeah? So I think the premise is wrong. So Silicon Valley has taken a couple hundred years. Big markers along that timeline is the opening of Stanford University, which I think was about 1900, roughly that sort of time. So Stanford was very pro-business. Down the line, it set up one of the first, probably the first actually, technology parks in the world, where many, many businesses have come from. So that was a big deal. So Stanford, over 100 years ago, was a big marker. And then 1935, I think it was, Hewlett-Packard, Bill and Dave set up Hewlett-Packard from a garage in what's now Silicon Valley. And out of Hewlett-Packard grew a very big company, lots of spin-offs came out of it. And the sort of funny story you might not know is that when Steve Jobs, of Apple fame, was about 13, he phoned up, I can never remember, is it Bill Hewlett or Dave Hewlett, but he phoned up one of them, because his name was still in the phone book at that point. And Steve Jobs said, hey, I'd like to have some spare parts because I'm trying to build a computer. And the Hewlett-Packard person got him in, helped give him the parts, but also became a bit of a mentor for him. And that's partly what Silicon Valley is about, but they call it paying it forward. So you've been successful, help somebody else along the line. So it becomes a big, almost self-fulfilling thing that's going on and growing. So I think it's the wrong question, and I think the right question is to think, what are we good at? And maybe 2 or 3 things that you're good at, not thinking about, just get my little timer going here, just thinking about what are we good at, not, what can we copy, can we be like a bad Elvis impersonator or something, but what can we be really good at? So any region, I think it's 1, 2 or 3 things, probably no more. I see some regions across Australia who've got, here's our focus list, and it's like 10 or 12 industries. And I think 10 or 12 industries is not focused. And surprise, surprise, they're the same 10 or 12 industries as the region next door or 500 k's down the road. They're pretty much the same industries. So pick 1 or 2, maybe even 3 for your area that could be big. And quick comparison to give you some actual facts as well as my random opinions. Let's look at venture capital investment. So venture capital investment is about large-scale institutional investment. They put in money, like several $1 million maybe, in return for an equity stake in that company. So that's what venture capital is about. So this chart will show you Australia versus the United States. So Australia, in this sort of just over a 10-year period, was $4.5 billion. Can you guess what was in the United States? 10, 20, 30? 285 billion. As we'd say in Ireland, a wee bit more. And it's got lines across it there, right? So it's a wee bit more, 285 billion, i.e. 280 billion more. So a hell of a lot more. Now, fair enough, the United States is a bigger country, as more people live there, so that's understandable. But at the same time, you kind of go, well, it's also a magnet, so lots of people from UK, Europe, India, etc. are moving to Silicon Valley, getting investment in their businesses, so it's not just a home turf thing. If you took it on a per capita basis, in terms of the per capita, the equivalent spend would be about 18 billion. It's roughly about 4 times, but still way back on the 285 billion. So it's a dramatically different thing. And of that US spend, roughly about half of that is accounted from San Francisco and the Silicon Valley, the Bay Area. So about half. So that's why I think it's verging on the ridiculous to say we're going to be the next Silicon Valley. I know it's probably well-meaning. It probably just means we're going to be a technology innovation hotspot. That's all great. That's all fair enough. But I think it's also a bit misleading and leads people to think about different and perhaps unusual things. I'm pressing that button again. I bet you I didn't do it that time, but there you go. Thank you. And here's the interesting fact that Australians spend more in one day on the Melbourne Cup than an entire venture capital industry invests in a year. So we all bet more on a horse. Now, that was a pretty recent stat, you know, but venture capital in the last 1 to 2 years, there have been a lot of announcements about a $50 million fund, a $100 million fund, and so on. So it will have changed a bit, but I wouldn't be surprised if we're still spending more on the Melbourne Cup than on venture capital investment. So this person, Vivek Wadha, is a technology entrepreneur. And he's also an adjunct professor at places like Duke University and Stanford University. So quite good universities, actually, those two. This is his view about this next Silicon Valley thing. Hundreds of regions all across the world collectively spend tens of billions of dollars trying to build their versions of Silicon Valley. I don't know of one single success. So again, this is saying, and this is suggesting, find your own things that you can be good at. Don't just try to mimic something else. Learn from it, understand from it, apply lessons, but don't just try to mimic the whole thing. One example I was following recently the last few years is just outside Moscow, the Russian government invested $2 billion in what they very much claimed would be their next Silicon Valley. It went well for the first year or two, actually, because it was under the previous president. I can't remember the guy who Putin put in. You probably don't either, but while under his leadership, it actually did well. But now the media reports heavy corruption, bureaucracy, and it's not thriving. So it didn't work with $2 billion. So closer to home, anybody recognize this small town? With pride. Sydney. You can see the Opera House up sort of middle left there. So it's Sydney. Now Sydney within Australia obviously has got the sort of the secret ingredient of a lot of innovation, which is density. So it has density. So it's got lots of population. It's got people close who can talk to each other, collaborate with each other, spark ideas with each other. And it's also got the density that brings with it universities and colleges and the students coming out of there and the academic staff. It has specialist law firms, investors. So there's a lot happening there in Sydney. There's a lot of good technology stuff happening in Sydney. But the whole of Australia is not Sydney. You know, more places I work with are places like Bundaberg, just right here, or Rocky, which are completely different. They haven't really got that density. Some people say if you've got a town or city over about 50,000, maybe over 100,000, then maybe you can get some of the particular dynamics that encourage things. Somewhere like Bundy and even Rocky don't really have that. And somewhere like this, where I've also worked, North Burnett, which is maybe about 3 hours west of Bundaberg, that sort of area, maybe about 3 hours south west of here. Those type of areas don't have density, so should North Burnett be the next Silicon Valley? No, shouldn't, of course not. Right? It should find out what it's good at, and I think within areas like this, and across Australia, you know, what I've seen the last 3 or 4 years particularly is there's an awful lot of potential in agriculture, in food. You know, I went to the Smart Farms presentation yesterday. Amazing opportunities in that space. And I think, you know, those are the types of areas where many regions would want to have a good, close look. One example from that particular region, North Burnett, is a business based in Monto. I just want to give you an example. It's a project that I worked on with Wide Bay Burnett Regional Organisation of Councils. So it was about 6 councils got together to have a business development accelerator, really, for some business in their region. This particular business, which was called Snowvac, and it's got a new name now, literally take hay, they put it through a big process, and they vacuum pack it, reduce the size significantly, give it a longer life. You can mix different types of varieties. You can even add stuff to it. So it's basically getting towards equine nutrition, and it's adding a lot of value. But those two, that young couple there, which was Kevin and Naomi, they felt pretty isolated. So locally there was a very thin economic base. It was difficult, very difficult to attract talent, limited finance locally. One of the biggest things that couple particularly felt was isolated from peers. So they really felt they had no one to talk to about their business in that town that really was going for more of a growth-oriented business. Clear ICT issues, so it's kind of tricky when you can't get one bar on your phone. Somebody might have mentioned that before, perhaps. Very tricky, but also distance to market. So the physical cost of transporting your product to one town over another depends if there's a delivery route going through to make it economic or not. Gets pretty tricky. And also access to service firms like accountants and lawyers, marketing firms, universities can be tricky. So we ran a program for them. That's their old website, which I'll show you their new one in a minute. It was called Snowvac, by the way, because the founder of that business had white hair, and his nickname was Snow, and it was vacuum packed. After a while, I suggested it might not be the best name in town, and we'll show you what they came up with. But we went through a process which was some face-to-face visits, which is kind of important for building trust and relationship, but then more of a sort of blended learning type of approach with some particular resources that they could do themselves, and we could contact via email and phone and things like that. So they went through this sort of business type of development process. The net result for them was quite significant. So they decided themselves, not me, to reposition their firm, moving up the sort of added value chain, a new name, which was 7 Horses Australia, because when the first fleet arrived in Australia, there were 7 horses in it, and their feeds 7 horses in different little biscuits. And totally repositioned themselves and getting into more added value, getting into exports, and within a year their sales are up about 40% because they went through this type of process. So, but you know, they're isolated. There's lots of firms like this, and they need some sort of support. And I think there's opportunities for this type of group to help deliver that. Trying to develop businesses in any region, there's only about 3 things we can do. So we can help both startups. There's been a lot of talk about that. We can work with established businesses with potential, or we can get the big magnet out and try to attract some new businesses into the region. Historically, there's been an awful lot of talk about the attract businesses. And again, there's a massive study that the New York Times did about two years ago, partly in conjunction with Richard Florida, the fairly well-known economic geographer. They studied, I can't remember, about several hundred regions in the United States about inward attraction, so paying companies a subsidy or an incentive to come locate in your town or city. And they found that they spent $80 billion per year for zero net effect. Zero net effect. So the businesses typically would have relocated anyway. They overpromise on the jobs they're going to do. And you're even getting to the silly stage where neighbouring states, you know, on the border, some companies moving over the border to get their incentive, and it gets rather silly. So I think my personal interest, there's obviously a role for it, and it can work in many cases, but my interest is more, let's grow startups and let's work with established businesses with potential. So talk about startups, let's go to the maternity hospital, and they pop out, here they are. So startups is really interesting, and you know, maybe about 15, maybe even 20 years ago, who had some of these things? You have some of these things? Yeah, probably a lot of people. So you'd have, like, there's about 7 or 8 gadgets or something. So you've got your Walkman and laptop and big camera and whatever that Pam Newton thing was called these days. I don't know. It did a diary and probably nothing else. But you thought it was great. It's fantastic. And your big brick mobile phone. So it's not too long ago. Well, the big news is about 7 years ago something happened. And it was that. And that little device here that many of us have, most of us have a smartphone, effectively combines all those types of functions. But the positive effect for that for entrepreneurs is that you can buy these things a few $100 or less sometimes, or $1,000 for a really fancy one. And it's basically democratizing innovation and technology. So it's opening up to many, many more people. So if all of us wanted to, we're all kind of forced, you know, somehow there was a big storm outside and we had to be locked in here, and we said, right, let's start a new business. That with using the right routes and websites and so on, probably in an hour or two we could have 100 businesses, you know, up online doing something. Dog grooming or whatever, yeah? So that's opening up opportunities for startups. Another example, I want to give a few examples, is I came over to Australia initially in 2002 to be the founding CEO of the Innovation Centre, part of the Sunshine Coast University. And that's the situation. It's a bit like, I guess it's more dense at Sunshine Coast than somewhere like Bundaberg or Rocky. But it's about 300,000 people, but they're spread over about 80 k's of coastline, really, and inland. So hasn't really got the density either. So you've got to create your own density, and this is one example. So a physical facility that today might house about 25 or 30 businesses. They're tapping into high-speed broadband. They've got their own office that can grow with them. They've got mentoring and so on. And they've got their own peer group. So the results from that from AEC Group in 2016 were that 143 startups had come out of there. Pretty amazing, actually 91% are still in business, which is a big figure if you know startups. 720 full-time equivalent jobs. This is the bit I like. 103 million annual output. It's been going for 10, 12, 13 years now, 14 years, something like that. If we're saying that's the level it's at now, and project forward the next 10 years, that's around about a 1 billion contribution to the local economy. That's significant. And the stuff that Jack Archer was talking about yesterday, with Regional Australia Institute, and the sort of regional dynamos, the Sunshine Coast was doing pretty well on some things, you spot it. It's not obviously entirely due to this, but this is one contributor in there, and it's reflective of the broader entrepreneurial culture going on. Okay. There's also a few sort of startup myths that I'd like to sort of bash on the head for a minute or two. Let's just do that. So this is one. This is not. I added the photograph just for artistic license. I just think every startup has to wear one of those hats. So we're all in trouble if you don't have a hat. And you have to. Beard helps. It's not essential, but it helps. So I added the photo, but the headlines sort of got me. Calling all hackers, hustlers, and hipsters. Come on down, let's start a business today. And this was a Queensland initiative. And it's all fine, it's all cool. But the message is that young hipsters, etc., are not the only people in town starting a business. So go do all that fun if you've also got one for middle-aged dudes who want to start a business as well. Right? Do that. So, all hipsters, hackers. So here's quick facts and checks. It's not all about 20-somethings. According to the Kaufman Foundation, if anybody's into this area, it's one of the absolute best research organizations in the world. It was one of these American foundations where somebody died, probably called Kaufman, left them millions of dollars and said, go research entrepreneurship. So they publish tons of amazing stuff. It's a very, very good group. So their research finds that the average age of a successful founder is 40. It's not 18 after all, there you go. It's not 22, it's 40. And the reason it's 40 is because those people have got some work experience, life experience. 70% of successful entrepreneurs spot their business idea from their previous experience. So they're out and about in their job, and they go, oh, that's interesting, that could be a business. Customers want that stuff, maybe I'll do that. And that helps. And maybe also they've got the finance, they've got the money. They might be able to borrow against their house, for example, but they might have a bit of money saved up. Their family stage might support this type of moves as well. Also, there's a little bit of a myth that everybody's going to be the next Facebook or Uber or whatever. If you hear another pitch presentation, we're going to be the next Uber of this and that and the other. The reality is that most startups are actually not innovative. Most create zero or few jobs, and they're out of necessity rather than opportunity. Also, the final thing I've put up there is there's a vast emphasis on coding and technology, things like that. Again, I'm not saying it's not important, but I'm saying other things are also important. Nesta, which is another one of these fantastic groups that is from London, it was funded by hundreds of millions of dollars from the Lottery Fund in the UK. So they're just a very well-resourced think tank research type of group that produces some very good work. I'll tell you more about it later, but they did a report about the vital 6%. So they found over tens of thousands of firms and high-growth firms, equal representation between high-tech and low-tech. Okay, so a lot of food type of companies these days can grow. They may not be very heavy techy. So it's certainly not all about tech. And in any case, the technology thing is kind of blurring a boundary these days. So, is like Airbnb a technology company, or is it a hotel that has a different business model? Almost every company today could be regarded as a a technology company to some extent, so it's beginning to blur the boundaries a bit. But what I'm saying is the sort of traditional split of we're high tech and we're sort of low tech or no tech. If you look at it that way, it's saying the low tech or almost no tech companies are also growth companies employing people, often at high value jobs as well. So it's not just one or the other. Let's not get too carried away. Just a little bit. So we're out of the maternity ward, right? We're out. We've got our wings, and we're a startup that's beyond the first 3-5 years, and we're going to grow. So this becomes scale-up territory, which is not a word you hear quite as much as startup, but it's probably a more important word, or phrase, or thing. So a scale-up technically is a company that, from the start of the observation period, has got 10 people and grows at 20% per annum over 3 years. So it's basically a fairly fast-growing company that's got a little bit of scale, as you can guess. These companies, I would suggest, are obviously equally important as startups. Many startups won't make it to this stage. So if you're kind of looking in the maternity ward into the little, just little cots and looking at the baby and go, you know, there, and you want to come back 5 years later. In business terms, many of those business babies will not be there. So it kind of makes sense to say, let's take a look at the 5-year point as well and see who's there and understand their needs and what they're doing. So scale-ups, those companies and businesses will have different issues. Their issues might be accessing the right employees. I know some companies in Sunshine Coast are about 20-30 staff. They're finding it amazingly difficult to find the next wave of employees, partly because they're in a regional area and partly because those highly skilled employees think you're kind of the only horse in town. And if I come and join you, where's my husband or wife going to work, and what happens if I leave, and so on. So it's a bit of a different thing. So they might have employee issues. Many of them will have leadership capability issues. So management development could come in there in terms of a lot of people I meet say, you know, I've never had 1 day's course or 1 minute's course about how to be the CEO of a growth company. And so executive education, I think, potentially has a role in that area of scale-ups. Now, we're getting to this vital 6%. This is a big deal implication. So again, Nesta found in a study that just 6% of high-growth companies generated actually over half of the UK's employment growth. So it's a very small amount of people, businesses. And they can be across all sectors. So again, it's not just tech. And they span established firms and startups and small businesses and large organizations. So it's a bit of a more sophisticated argument, perhaps, than saying it's all about startups. Now, if that is the case, I would say for everybody here and for our regions, we'd say, well, who's our vital 6%? Who are they? There's ways and means of identifying those people. Not maybe perfect, but there's ways and means of doing it. And looking at those people and saying, who are they? Maybe actually go and speak to them and say, what's your issues? And begin to figure out ways that can help. And I know people have done some work in this area. This is one small example of South Burnett, which is the area around Kingaroy, where I've done some work about a year ago. Very small area. They've got about 3,200 businesses. And this is the population sort of business pyramid they have. And it's actually, even though they're a small area, the overall pattern is not that dissimilar to many other parts of Australia and many other parts of the world. So they've got 61%, 2,000 businesses or so, who are non-employing. And another bunch, 800 odd, who are 1 to 4 staff, and so on. You can see the figures. So for them, they're about 6% of that business base is around about 200 businesses. And again, it's not any exact science, but it's better than what many regions are doing at the moment. It's a good idea to begin to figure out who are they and what do they need. So just moving to finish up, I think a lot of the stuff these days, the discussion's moving on a bit from startups and so on, and it's moving on to innovation ecosystems. So not startup ecosystems, but innovation ecosystems, which is wider in a couple of levels. So right in the middle of that, you've got, and this is just my own little diagram, startups, scale-ups, and large established companies. Because my point is that innovation does come from all of these groups. So they're important things for your city or region to take a look at them and bring them together through various means. Some of the things that can help around is events can help. So these days, again, I've talked about the sort of democratization of innovation. Much more of this sort of agenda and stuff and action is actually moving to private sector, maybe supported by some public sector, but a lot of it is private sector. So if you're a bunch of entrepreneurs in Rockhampton or Bundaberg or wherever, it's easy and it's free to set up a Facebook page, call it Startup Bundaberg or Innovation Bundaberg, whatever you want, and get a group of a couple hundred people behind it, and then begin to organise some good professional events to help people get, learn from other more successful business people, peer group development, and so on. Funding, there's some interesting initiatives, particularly in US, which are tapping into local money with local businesses. So again, even in Australia, naturally a lot of the venture capital is concentrated in Sydney. And somebody in Sydney working for one of those VC firms is probably going to be not that keen to get on the 4 flights to get to wherever to go and see one business. They want to see 20 in a day or something and pick one. But there are some initiatives which are tapping into wealthy local individuals who want to give something back to the community and want to make a commercial return. And I think there's good opportunities for developing those type of initiatives here in Australia. Places are still important, so you might not necessarily need a big innovation centre, but places are still important to bring people together and access sometimes fast-speed broadband. Just go back a bit. Service providers are amazingly important, but they don't have to be in the region always. So specialist lawyers, IP firms, R&D consultants, those type of people. At the Innovation Centre, we had about half a dozen of those, which were Brisbane-based firms, and they had a visiting office with us. So they didn't need to be there all the time. They could have a visiting presence, and accesses their knowledge and network. Mentors and government. That type of picture there, which you saw there, which is an innovation ecosystem, locally communities are doing things like that with it, which is just drawing it up, beginning to figure out who's who and who. Large companies, mentors, etc. And if you go really crazy, that's Portland, Oregon, down there mapping all their startups in that particular case. But it's kind of important to know who is who in the zoo. A lot of them are quite isolated. It's good to begin to bring people together and also just understand their needs and begin to communicate that. And finishing up, last slide, I think, is conclusions. Number one, there's only one Silicon Valley. It's had a 200-year head start on all of us. If we want to start today and go after it, yeah, we can, but we're not going to be the same as it, and we shouldn't really be. The question is, what do we want to be? What can we be? And it's beyond simple startups. So you've got to question those assumptions. Is it all young? Is it all tech? There's a book by Deloitte, it's called 10 Types of Innovation, I use quite a lot. So there's lots and lots of different types of innovation. It's not just technology. It's business model, finance, marketing, supply, etc. So it's not just technology. Does it have to be venture capital backed? Well, no is the answer. We need really to get on top of the importance of scale-ups, which is an overly neglected sector. If you probably did a bit of a Google, I imagine you'd probably find about 95% startups, 5% scale-ups. But that's not the balance that we need. It needs to be 50-50 or maybe even something like 30 startups, 70% scale-ups. That's the sort of balance that we need to switch to, I think. In your region, try to identify and support those businesses, and particularly help owner-managers at different types of business to succeed and develop their businesses. So I think executive education opportunities in short courses, very short courses sometimes, and build that ecosystem so it begins to take on a life of its own. If you can begin even as a simple thing of there's a meetup group on Facebook and there's 200 people gradually go on it, and there's half a dozen events per year, that begins to take on a life of its own. And people begin to meet each other and go, you do this and I do that, why don't we get together and set up a new business or do something together or just spark an idea. That happens. It's very, very important to just create your own density in an area. So that's really it for me. Happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.